Welcome to another edition of the Westminster News podcast. Michael Heaver here, joined by Dr. Rakib Ehsan, Research Fellow at the Henry Jackson Society. How are you doing, sir? Or doctor, I should say.
I'm doing well, Michael. How are you?
Good, mate. I like speaking to you because you're, like me, you're a straight-talking fella. You aren't afraid to say what is on your mind. And a really interesting piece recently that you wrote for Westminster entitled How Woke Orthodoxy is Infiltrating the Counter-Extremism Space. Now, for those that haven't read the piece, and if you haven't, guys, go over to westminster.com and make sure that you do. Can you explain what the main thrust of your argument was?
So essentially, Michael, we have a body called the National Association of Muslim Police. They suggested that the term Islamist should be dropped from counter-terrorism lexicon. They felt that it was harmful for community relations. It made Muslim people who were working in the counter-terrorism space uncomfortable. The point I made in the piece that you've discussed, which you kindly uploaded on the Westminster website, I made the point that this was part of a ever-rising wave of censorious behaviour in the counter-terrorism space, where people are looking to police language surrounding terrorism-related activity. The reality of the matter is this, Michael. If there's a Muslim fundamentalist and they, through religious motivations, conduct a terrorist attack, that is an Islamist terrorist attack. There's no two ways about it. And they provided these interesting alternative phrases such as adherence to Osama bin Laden's ideology, faith-claimed terrorism. There's a bit of grievance in there as well, saying that, oh, well, in these cases of Christian fundamentalism, that's never mentioned in other terrorist attacks which are conducted by Christian fundamentalists. Well, I can tell you that, Michael, that's not true at all, because I co-authored a report for the Henry Jackson Society, which commented on an anti-Semitic Christian fundamentalist terrorist attack in Poway last year. And in the report, made it very clear how this particular terrorist attack, there were fundamentalist Christian motivations behind it. So I just felt that more generally, this was an example of woke orthodoxy now looking to influence thinking within the counter-terrorism space. And I think it's deeply unhelpful, Michael, because you need to be realistic and honest about those religious motivations which underpin terrorist attacks. Because when you're looking to perhaps formulate anti-extremist counter-terrorism narratives, when you're looking to challenge these sorts of extremist narratives in local communities, you need to understand what you're working against. And if you're not being honest about that, then you're undermining counter-terrorism efforts in the UK.
Yeah, you make a number of interesting points in the piece. You say, as a patriotic British Muslim, I'm firmly of the view that identitarian leftists who seek to police language surrounding Islamist extremism should not be entertained in the counter-terrorism space. And in a time of rising extremism and the massive terror threat we face, why do you think we constantly see this sort of navel gazing on policing language instead of focusing on the monumental and growing task in hand in thwarting violent extremism in Britain?
Well, it's easy, isn't it? When you're talking about, oh, you shouldn't say this, you shouldn't say that. This is very easy politics. When we're talking about trying to formulate and introduce more robust security arrangements, people seem to be less interested when it comes to those sort of things. But I think ultimately that's what should be prioritized when it comes to public institutions working in the counter-extremism space. I find it quite amazing that of all the things that the National Association of Muslim Police would want to talk about, there's so many things they could talk about. Perhaps improving public confidence within British Muslim communities in relation to Prevent. The reality of the matter is there's research that's been done by Crest Advisory which shows that when it comes to confidence in Prevent, or at least expressing support for the core objectives of Prevent, there is impressive levels of public support within British Muslim communities. So this idea, what you have, Michael, is that you have these associations. They're not very representative at all, and they look to speak on behalf of an imaginary British Muslim community. on issues such as counter-extremism. And I think it's deeply unhelpful. And I think, to be honest, I think they receive a disproportionate level of attention. And I think it needs to be called out, because the reality of the matter is these associations, they are not there to be policing language. They're there to ultimately come out. They should be really producing ideas to improve policing and ultimately maximize public safety and community security.
Now, just moving on more broadly to the scale of the terror threat faced by Britain. I know you're an expert on this, so I want to get your insights on it. But
sure.
I wonder how many people are aware of this fact, of this figure that came out recently from the Security Minister, James Brokenshire. He said that in the last 3 years alone, the UK has foiled 25 terror attacks. Now, I think that is an astonishing number. If you can think if even half of those were successful, I mean, the amount of carnage we would have seen, and our security services have done a very, very good job, obviously stopping those attacks. But it shows you, doesn't it, the level of threat is scary.
It is, Michael. There's no two ways about it. I think it's very interesting that over the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, there is growing evidence that extremists have actually looked to upscale their activities. Especially Islamic State instructing jihadists to strike the West when public authorities are preoccupied with getting to grips with the COVID-19 pandemic. So we really have to be on the ball. Our security agencies, on the whole, do a fantastic job in terms of keeping the country safe, which is precisely why we're, going back to earlier, I don't want identitarian leftist associations, distracting them. Indulging in issues which, quite frankly, are a fundamental waste of time and energy. I think that more broadly, there has been comments made by counter-extremism officials that far-right extremism is the fastest growing threat. I find it very interesting, Michael. That this is very basic mental arithmetic, because some people think that means that far-right extremism is the main threat. It's really not the main threat. I can tell you now that the prevailing terrorism threat in this country is from Islamist extremism. So I think it's for me, working in the field of counter-extremism, I think a big part of my role now is actually challenging those deeply inaccurate narratives. That's not to say we should take all forms of extremism seriously, but I think there's this sort of idea that we need to mollycoddle certain groups. I think it's the bigotry of low expectations to suggest that using the term Islamist is disrespectful to the vast majority of law-abiding British Muslims who live in the UK. But unfortunately, that is what identitarian leftist associations are very good at.
I just want to turn attention now to more comments made by, this time, from Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. He recently, and we've heard about, and we've seen reports before about the fact of returning jihadists. He said recently that around 900 of the foreign fighters who travelled to the region to go and support Islamic State during the conflict came from the UK, 900. And he said that of these, approximately 20% have been killed, 40% are still in the region, but 40% have returned to the UK. Now, the last report I saw on this was in 2018 in the Telegraph, and they reported that the prosecution rate for returning jihadists was just 10%. And I simply can't get my head around this entire development, how it has been, firstly, why these people have been allowed back anyway. Secondly, how 90% of them haven't even been prosecuted. I mean, the amount of resources it must take to ensure and constantly monitor people battle hardened and dedicated enough to have gone out there in a very, very dangerous situation, obviously, to go and support this death cult. I mean, I think it's crazy that any have been allowed back. But can you give your insight into the aspect of returning jihadists?
I think that you're spot on, Michael. And I think people actually be quite frightened of some of those statistics that you've mentioned. The reality of the matter is, our politicians, in a number of ways, they've been sleeping at the wheel, Michael. Right? We need to have a fundamental modernisation of treason laws, which carry very serious penalties for people who have clearly joined organisations which are fundamentally anti-British and are intent on destroying Western civilization, which the UK is very much part of. And that should include, travelling to particular parts of the world. And I feel that politicians, and I think unfortunately there's sections of the judiciary as well, all too often, Michael, they prioritize the human rights of criminals, people who've been involved in terrorism-related activity, over the public safety of the law-abiding majority. And I don't think I'm alone in thinking that at all. The stats you mentioned is clear. There are huge resources that need to go into ensuring prosecution of such individuals. They travel to areas where it's very difficult to collect evidence. For example, that'd be one point that I would make, which is why I do think ultimately you need to be on the ball, introduce pass legislation which leads to a fundamental modernisation of treason laws. Because Michael, we're talking about individuals; they are treasonous. They are traitors. There's no two ways about it. If you want me to be blunt, that is the way I describe them, because they're ultimately joining genocidal terrorist organisations who want to introduce. They want to create a global Islamic caliphate, and they will do that through violent means. So the reality of the matter is, if you don't think that's traitorous, I don't know what is, to be honest, Michael.
Yeah, I just find it absolutely insane that when you look at the amount of resources, obviously our security services are obviously having to put in, as I said, they've stopped 25 terror attacks in 3 years. And at the same time as they're having to deal with potential extremists already in the UK, you're then allowing hundreds of people who have obviously gone out and supported Islamic State back into the country. I mean, I just think the whole thing's mad. I don't see how it's been done. And I think, it must be absolute pandemonium in terms of our security services trying to stay on top of that added threat.
And there's another threat, Michael, the level of radicalisation within our prison system. There's some very serious issues there.
Tell us a bit more about that.
Well, people trying to introduce, introduce a system within prisons where disputes are resolved in accordance with strict interpretation of Sharia law. That is happening within the British prison system. The Ministry of Justice, in recent times, they've published a report which showed how prisoners, through intimidation and violence, are coercing fellow prisoners to convert to Islam. So you have all of these things happening in the UK, Michael, and I think it is deeply worrying, whether it's returning jihadists, homegrown extremism, processes of radicalisation in the prison system. We've got our work cut out. There's no two ways about it.
I just want to focus on a tweet that you put out recently. It involved Calvin Robinson, who's been on been on this podcast. He said, you said young black men like Calvin Robinson who reject identity politics, possess a family-centric mentality, promote academic discipline, and value personal responsibility are increasingly viewed as the enemy by progressives who are intent on spreading their grievance narratives. Could you expound on that?
Well, I think for me, Michael, I think the likes of Calvin Robinson, they're a complete inconvenience for the identitarian warriors on the contemporary British left. The reality of the matter is, this is, once again, it's a classic case of where they try to homogenise all black people in the UK, try to depict them as collectively as an oppressed group, which is devoid of individual agency, and they couldn't be further from the truth. The reality of the matter is, the likes of Calvin, they prioritise personal responsibility. They want to exercise a degree of individual initiative which leads to fundamental positive change in their lives. The reality of the matter is, when we often talk about, we talk about quotas, we talk about ethnic minority people being at the top level of business, firms, in the education sector, sports, all the rest of it. The reality of the matter is, what they're really saying is, we would support this if the individuals fall in line with our political agenda. Do you really think someone like me, if I make it near the top in any industry, that's going to delight these kind of people? I don't think it will, Michael. So this idea that they say, this is excellent if we had more black and Asian faces in these roles, they'd only be happy with it if those black and Asian people fall neatly with their own grievance narratives. Now, Calvin is very clear that he rejects identity politics. He's a patriotic man. He cares a great deal about his country, and he rejects these depictions of Britain being a fundamentally racist country, when there's a number of studies which show that the UK is a relatively anti-racist, tolerant, anti-discriminatory society in comparison to equivalently developed countries in the EU. So someone like Calvin, he's a complete inconvenience, largely because of the values that he holds, in combination with the fact that he is a young black man.
Yeah, I think there's a definite class aspect to this as well, because I've picked up, and you've seen it in America a bit as well, it tends to be sort of white, middle class, hoity-toity types who want to speak on behalf of other people, who they class as an entire group. I mean, this is absolute nonsense. Like, for my background, all different ethnicities and backgrounds, you know, I've never, ever looked at the world or as individuals as belonging to groups. And, you know, even in mainstream media and day by day language, we hear things like the black community, the Muslim community. I mean, just imagine how ludicrous it would be if someone said, oh yeah, I'm a spokesman on behalf of the white community. That's absolutely bonkers. So how can you homogenize and group together such large groups? And as I said, I think we're seeing this increasingly, that sort of on the far left, we are speaking on behalf of this group of people. Well, that isn't the way the world works, is it, when you've got a brain?
It's absolutely terrible. I think that the idea that people are talking about white people as some sort of homogenous group is nonsense as well. I think if you actually look in a number of ways, people of white British origin and people of white Irish origin living in England, they're different in a great number of ways. So I think that more broadly, when we're looking at this kind of issue, that tendency to homogenize, Michael, I'm sure you're familiar with my concept of the white British saviour. So essentially, you know, from a fairly chattering class background, they have a university degree, then they think that they're ultimately, you know, in the higher reaches of intellectual credibility as a result of this, and they feel that they need to speak on behalf of an oppressed BAME community. I mean, let me tell you something. Even within the Black African origin population, that includes war-torn people who come from refugees from war-torn areas of the Horn of Africa, including people of Somalian Muslim origin. It also includes more well-established Christian people of West African origin. So it really, I've made the point that, Michael, my PhD looked at social and political attitudes within British ethnic minorities. There is no such thing as a BAME community. There really isn't. There's a great deal of diversity in a number of ways when you're looking at the broader non-white ethnic minority population. And also, listen, Michael, you make a great point about class, right? What really does, say, a white, socially liberal, university educated individual in a core city such as London, what do they really have in common with the blue collar working class worker in Redcar? But interestingly now, Labour is less popular in that amongst that second category in comparison to the first one, which I think is bonkers. But that tells you about the fundamental realignment of British politics. So yes, Michael, I think that the left, in a lot of ways, they've lost their enthusiasm for the bread and butter issues. You know, issues such as work, family, community, and all the rest of it. Those kind of values, to be honest, that different ethnic and religious groups could buy into. Instead, they go down this sort of this road of tribal identity politics, which, quite frankly, I think the average British voter, they have very little time for, and don't really have any time. They don't have the time or inclination to understand it at all.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with you. I think on the whole, people in Britain generally get along with one another. I think, and I think the way that you counteract extremism is you treat people as individuals. I think this whole, and you do see it whipped up a lot in the media now, people put forward as if they speak for large groups of others. And that simply, life doesn't work. If you go down the street and knock on 10 doors, you're going to get different political opinions, let alone when you're grouping hundreds of thousands or millions of people together. And I think it's bad for society. And I hope as we move forward, Ben Habib, for instance, is someone, former Brexit Party MEP colleague, who pushes back he said, I'm not BAME, I'm Ben Habib. Treat me as Ben Habib. That is who I am. And that is the way I think we should be teaching our children and people in society to look at the world and look at our country, surely.
Michael, I agree. I think it deprives people of a, sort of an individual personal identity. And I think, as I've said before, unfortunately, the left is going into an increasingly divisive direction. Uh, if people think that Sir Keir Starmer, for example, replacing Jeremy Corbyn as party leader is going to lead to huge positive change on this front, they're sorely mistaken, because the reality of the matter is you still have a cohort of young pro-Corbyn politicians within the Labour Party, people such as Nadia Whittome, Zara Sultana. You still have Dawn Butler in the Labour Party, who said that the UK government needs to get its knee off its neck off the BAME community. This is hugely racially divisive language, and I feel that ultimately, I think that there are an increasing number, I feel, of ethnic minority people who feel increasingly alienated from the Labour Party as well, because they ultimately are of the view that, well, in some cases, yes, they feel that there needs to be an improvement in terms of racial fairness in certain areas. They feel that it's going too much the other way, in the sense that Labour are framing every single group inequality as a product of structural racism. It's really not the case, Michael. The inequalities, when you're investigating inequalities which exist in British society, you have to look at problematic internal cultural factors. What are community attitudes towards women, being in work, for example? What are attitudes towards female economic empowerment? What's the sort of culture when it comes to family planning? Because the reality of the matter is, Michael, if you have a two-income sensible household with a smaller number of children, you're more likely to be financially secure. It's just basic economic logic. There's certain communities, unfortunately, which do have those sort of ultra-conservative gender norms, which there are hostile attitudes towards women working. And in turn, you have you could say the breadwinner, who might be in a low-paid menial role. And on top of that, if they have a larger number of children, that is a perfect recipe for poverty. Now, what is that? Is that structural racism? No, that's really looking at issues of personal responsibility, family planning. But needless to say, the left would never touch that with a barge pole, because even though exploring those kind of issues is important if you want to come up with a productive anti-poverty program, they ultimately want to frame every single inequality in the UK as a direct product of structural racism, and I think it's deeply unhelpful.
Well, look, I think you've taken apart the Labour Party view there expertly.
Not bad at that.
Listen,
Michael, I traditionally vote for the Labour Party.
Yeah.
That's probably why I'm so sensitive about it,
Well, no, there you go. And there's just one more thing I want to talk to you about. I saw you put out a tweet recently talking about the reintroduction of capital punishment in the UK, you say especially for lethal acts of terrorism. A poll that I'm keen to highlight, because everyone else pretty much has ignored it, that shows you the gap between the sort of commentary and the great British public. Redfield and Wilton Strategies, 15th of July. Question: to what extent would you support or oppose reinstating the death penalty for those convicted of terrorism in the UK? Very specific, of those convicted of terrorism in the UK. 51% of Brits in favour, barely a quarter, 26% opposed. That's where mainstream British public opinion is.
Well, I think it just shows that there's such a gulf. There's a real separation in attitudes of what I would consider to be the political establishment and the British public on those kind of issues. I think it's very interesting that the public, they do make differentiations between different types of murder. So, for example, if it's a terrorism related murder, I think there's probably the perception that this isn't just, even though it's terrible for the families who lose their loved ones who are killed in those attacks, you can almost see it as an attack against the entire society in terms of the main values and principles that it stands for. Terrorist attacks, I think, in my view, they're a fundamental attack against the sort of liberal democratic principles of the UK. I think, Michael, I mean, I got a fair bit of stick when I did declare my support for the capital punishment. The reality is, Michael, you know me, that I'm originally of Bangladeshi origin. I've supported state-sponsored state executions in Bangladesh for Islamists who were guilty of perpetrating atrocities against Bangladesh in its liberation war back in 1971. I can't be a hypocrite and support the death penalty in my country of origin and then not support it in the country that I was born and raised in. The reality of the matter is, I think that there's too many people, there's too many extremists with deadly intentions who think that Britain is a soft touch. And I think there's many people who, and many criminals as well, who think that Britain is a soft touch. Now, people say, oh, it's not a very effective measure in terms of deterrence and all the rest of it. My central view is this: when you kill someone, you have fundamentally given up your own sort of, how do you say, your own human rights. Okay, so people make that human rights argument. And I think that there has to be a stronger element of retribution. I think people too often, they believe in the power of rehabilitation. I think that's been fundamentally misplaced. And I think that's been demonstrated by the fact that there have been convicted terrorists who've gone on these state-run Home Office rehabilitation programs. They've gone on them and then they've conducted further terrorist attacks afterwards. We've believed in the power of rehabilitation too much. And I think there needs to be a strong injection of retribution when it comes to our judicial system.
Dr. Rakib Ehsan, absolutely fascinating insight as ever. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. We'll have to get you back on soon, mate.
Mate, no worries at all. My pleasure.
Take care, mate.
You too.